Hello and greetings from the University of Notre Dame Press. My name is Jake Kildoo and I'm a postdoctoral fellow here at the Press. We're so excited to be here today with our Books for Better Understanding author event series. Today's featured authors are Yitz Greenberg and Ariel Burger, who have each partnered with Notre Dame Press to release new editions of two classic works from Nobel Prize winner Elie Wiesel. Yitz has kindly written an introduction to Wiesel's four Hasidic masters and their struggle against melancholy. And Ariel has provided an equally splendid introduction to Wiesel's five biblical portraits. The new editions of these books will be published this month by the Notre Dame Press. Today we'll have a chance to hear from each of these scholars, both of whom had close personal relationships with Wiesel himself. But first, let me introduce our guests more fully. Rabbi Yitz Greenberg is an American scholar, author, and rabbi. He's a leading Jewish thinker and has written extensively on post-Holocaust Jewish religious thought, Jewish-Christian relations, pluralism, and the ethics of Jewish power. Meanwhile, Ariel Burger is the founding director and senior scholar at the Witness Institute, whose mission is to empower emerging leaders inspired by the life and legacy of Elie Wiesel. He's a lifelong student of Professor Wiesel from the age of 15, and he's also the author of National Jewish Book Award winner Witness, Lessons from Elie Wiesel's Classroom. Thank you both so much for being here with us today.
Thank you, Jacob.
Great, so to begin, I was wondering if each of you could talk maybe a bit about how you came to know Elie Wiesel and what your relationship with him looked like. Maybe we could start with Yitz.
In 1961, in my previous existence, I was a historian of American intellectual history and planning to do an academic career. In 1961, I won a Fulbright to teach at Tel Aviv University and stumbled into the Holocaust, and which I was sort of vaguely aware of, but hadn't really affected my life. That particular experience was overwhelming. It shattered a lot of my standard religious understanding, and I spent the rest of the year, 95% of the time, just reading feverishly at Yad Vashem. Sometime near the end of that year, sometime I think in early 1962, I came across this book called Night by Elie Wiesel, and was, of course, very moved by it, but I had no idea who he was or where he was. I decided to get the book. I couldn't get a copy in Israel, and I came back. I went looking in New York. I couldn't find a copy. I finally found at a used bookstore a copy with a torn cover. I thought the book was out of print, but of course, many years later, Elie's agent, George Burchell, who was never out of print, it just wasn't distributed because the publisher was not a very competent or important publisher. Some years later, 1964, 65, a friend told me the author of that memoir, which had left this really indelible impression on me, is living in New York. And so I had no idea if he was alive, let alone he was living in New York. So I finally tracked him down and went to visit him. When I came into the room, he was, Elie Wiesel, many of you will recall, he was gaunt. He seemed like he was starving. He was haunted. And he was a journalist. He wrote for Yediot, a Hebrew newspaper, and as a stringer for French and Yiddish newspapers. And from all three, he made not much of a living. He was all but unknown because no one at the time wanted to hear about the Holocaust. He amazingly persisted steadfastly. And when I came and visited with him, when he spoke about it, it was mesmerizing. It was so gripping because you felt you were hearing a voice almost still in that world, and it made it so powerful and so present. I must say I fell in love with him at that point, and I probably never quite got over it because, if nothing else, I thought of the heroism he he came out of the war as a 17-year-old without family, without context, without his home community been wiped out. And he had came to this inner burning mission to testify and to witness to the world of what happened. And that he was able to do this. I mean, if there's anything that would break your heart as any kind of a person, you have a dream, you have an ideal, and you're passionate about it, but no one wants to hear, or people listen and walk away. The fact that he had the courage and the strength to persist in his witness to an indifferent world, it just overwhelmed me. At the end of the conversation, I was trying to think, what can I cheer him up? He came across a little sad. So I said to him, you know, if I ever have a chance, I'm going to get you a job. I'm offer you a job. It was a silly statement I had. I was a rabbi. I had no academic power. Well, in 1972, I was offered the chairmanship of the Jewish Studies Department at City College. They were creating a new department. And the first appointment, I went to administration to get him a distinguished professorship, not a professorship. And by the way, that was the first full-time job he ever had that he could make a living from. And he many times thanked me for that. Well, of course, he came to City College and we worked together for 4 or 5 years. Our offices were next door to each other. We talked a lot. On the one hand, he helped me found an organization called Klal, whose mission was to teach and to spread to the Jewish community Torah, Jewish learning. But
Yitz, I think we may have lost you a bit. Did he freeze for you as well?
Yeah.
sorry. So as a result of that particular exchange, the President's Commission on the Holocaust by President Carter was appointed to decide what the United States government should do to remember the Holocaust. We got the administration to appoint him as the chairman of that commission, and he always complained that he's not an administrator, so he asked me to come work with him and take care of the nitty-gritty stuff. So I served as executive director. And of course, we did that work together through the creation of the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum. So I want to say just one more thing about this. So the personal relationship grew all this time. He's a gracious, very warm, friendly person, never forgets and never fails to look out and try to help and try to share with friends and people. The other thing I want to say about him is that he grew into a world figure. In other words, from the commission, from the museum, he then spread out. He became a Nobel laureate, particularly for his work as a human rights advocate throughout the world. And of course, as an advocate against bystanding. But again, speaking as the personal side, he never lost that dedication. And he never let the fame or the recognition or the importance of his positions distract him from his genuine service as a witness, living testimony to that world, and as a teacher who tried to get all of humanity to learn the lesson of never standing by such persecution.
Yeah, that's incredible. Goodness, thank you for sharing that. Yeah, Ariel, could you speak a bit about your relationship, maybe?
Sure, and it's an honor and a pleasure to be here with my teacher, Rav Yitz. It's a rare opportunity for us to get together in recent days, so I'm grateful for that. It's also always fascinating to me to hear of Professor Wiesel in the decades before I was born, before I met him, and to see some of the arc of his development as a person, because when I met him, by the time I met him, he was a person of great joy and still carried the intensity and the shadow and the burden of witness, but was also capable of frequent laughter and told jokes often in the classroom. And so that arc, I think that developed over time. is my understanding, is that the meeting his wife, Marianne Wiesel, and having a family and having friends like Rav Yitz and other close friends allowed him to really reclaim joy, even together with the darkness that he was carrying and bearing witness to. So that's always really fascinating to hear. I met Professor Wiesel when I was 15 years old in 1990. And I met him at a lecture at the 92nd Street Y. He gave public lectures every year. My stepfather, Mati Lazar, introduced me to Professor Wiesel. They knew each other through a musical connection. Mati's a conductor and a driving force behind the Jewish musical movement in America and Israel. And Professor Wiesel was also very deeply involved in music from childhood, and after the war also as a choral conductor briefly, and was the president of the Zamir Choral Foundation that my stepfather started, and was very, very involved in music as a way of expressing things that cannot be expressed in words. And so I was the beneficiary of that friendship. And I met Professor Wiesel after the lecture in the small reception hall at the 92nd Street Y. And I remember there's a line to wait your turn to say hello to Professor Wiesel. This is 4 years after he's won the Nobel Prize. He's very well known. And I remember I got to the head of the line and he held his hand out to me and he said his name as if I had no idea who he was. And then he said, "Come and see me and bring a question." And so it took me a little bit of time to build what the Hasidim call the holy chutzpah to actually take him up on his offer. But I did eventually, I went to see him. I had a lot of questions. And that began a conversation of a teacher and a student over many, many years, where with incredible, unbelievable generosity to me and to other students, he made a lot of time. He opened his door and he helped me negotiate and navigate a lot of questions about tradition and creativity, and my particular Jewish identity and universal human commitments, and faith and doubt, and many other really central questions. And over time, I became his teaching assistant at Boston University, where he taught, and I did my doctoral thesis with him, and some other projects. And the work I'm doing today is all a way of paying that generosity forward.
That's amazing. Yeah, thank
you. If I can break in with a comment, because you reminded me of your comment about his joy and laughter. The truth is, the first few years I met him and worked with him, I really said to myself, he's never going to get married, never going to have a family, because I felt like he was not completely out of that world, even though he was in my world, and even though he was a very charming and very, strong presence. It didn't matter. It was just, it was, you felt that this had him in his chain. And I always felt a very special gratitude to Mary and his wife, because I felt like almost like it was like something out of, I don't know, something out of, King Arthur's, the lady who crosses the lake and takes him across the lake, except in her case, she takes King Arthur, from this world to this island. She was the reverse. I felt she went across there and lifted him without breaking that profound witness connection. But she sort of brought him, I felt, into our world and the family, and of course, and you're quite correct about his sense of humor and his ability to laugh. The other thing that struck me in your comments, because he was very rooted, that was his childhood in Hasidus, had a beautiful voice. And I spent a few Shabbat with him, where he did what you might call the tish in rabbinic, in Hasidic rabbis. And he would talk and he would share words of wisdom, and then he would sing. And again, he had a marvelous voice and it was, if you wouldn't know him from a different place, you would see this is Elie Wiesel. He was a very multifaceted, and again, it was charming and mesmerizing. And then again, as I said, if you met him during the week, or if you met him in his work of witness, it was a different experience. But yes, over the years, he developed
Yitz, I think we've lost you a bit again.
Joy in that musical and that inspirational part of him.
I have to jump in, Jacob. If you want to do any tech check stuff, please feel free to interrupt me in a moment. I just have to share that the choice to have a family and the choice to invest in students were both really profound choices and unlikely choices to invest in hope. And Ravitz, I was in Orange County, California a few years ago teaching, and I was approached by a woman who told me that she spent a Shabbat with you and Professor Wiesel sometime in the must have been early 70s. And as a result of that Shabbat, and especially the Friday night singing of Zemirot, of Shabbat songs that you did, her whole life changed, and she reconnected to her Jewish heritage, and there are 3 generations of a family deeply involved in Jewish life and in giving to the community as a result of that one experience with the 2 of you. So I didn't know that the 2 of you also went on the road and did these the musical Shabbatot.
This is a little indulgent. I'll make it a short comment. We didn't normally do that kind of thing. I did spend a few Shabbatot with him on the road, but that particular weekend you're talking about, we founded the organization called Cloud, which again started as an idea in my mind, but I would sit and talk with Elie about it, particularly about the fact that the Jewish community hadn't grasped yet what a transformation it must undergo to understand and deal with the Holocaust and with Israel. And of course, he felt the same way. And we talked about this idea of an organization. Elie was never much for organizations. And of course, he was tremendously devoted. He worked and wrote every day. So he did not get involved in the nitty gritty, but he said he'll be happy to lend himself and his name, get it started. That was the founding weekend. We invited people from all over the country to come and hear about a pitch for the organization Cloud. And again, as I said, he was the what would you call it? The draw. He was the great draw. By then, by 74, he was better known. He wasn't the Elie Wiesel of the 80s and 90s who were world famous, but he was the draw. So yes, and it was a very special pleasure. And again, as I said, when he would relax and share his thinking, his Torah, share his singing and his joy, it was a profoundly moving and exciting, uplifting for me, who was professionally and personally spent a lifetime on these activities, but so doubly so for people like this woman.
Oh, that's beautiful. Great. So this is a question that I think both of you have sort of alluded to answers to a little bit. One theme that you each addressed in the introductions that you've written for these 2 books is the challenge of having faith in a post-Holocaust world. And how Wiesel sort of teaches contemporary people of faith, and in particular Jewish folks, how to remain in touch with their tradition in a way that sort of stands up to this challenge. Could you maybe talk a bit about some of the lessons that Elie Wiesel teaches contemporary people of faith?
Make it very short. I think, by the way, he's, of course, a remarkable Jewish teacher of Jewishness and of Jewish religion and Jewish faith to Jews, but I feel his primary influence and message is far beyond the Jewish community. Any person of religious seeking or search would I think, be inspired or shaped by Wiesel's thinking. And I would summarize it very simply. Faith and doubt can coexist. The presence of God and the absence of God is legitimate. It's a genuine experience. And he was honest and completely with integrity, would tell of his experiences in the Holocaust. And of course, that famous or extraordinary scene when they hang a child and the child is strangling slowly, and he bursts out as a prisoner. There is God hanging on the hanging. It was, again, in other words, he was completely honest about this. And you see in one person profound faith, a sense of God's presence, and profound doubt and a sense of God's absence in the same person at the same moment, and it's legitimate. And it's richer than a simple faith or a simple denial. Secondly, he taught us that arguing with God, which he does a lot of in his writing, is a legitimate and constructive relationship. And sometimes after the Holocaust, which cuts you off from God, maybe the only way in, or certainly one of the better ways in, is to argue with God. And then, of course, another thing which I feel is far beyond the Jewish community, that he taught us the suffering should never be justified or explained as punishment. God is not, the Holocaust was not God's punishment, despite what many traditional Jews tried to argue, but rather in the suffering, God is with us, but that's very different than the notion that God is inflicting it us or punishing us. I would say the last comment is, again, having communicated the anguish and the total cruel, vicious, being torn apart by the suffering, his message is stop it. In other words, that the best response and the most powerful, authentic response is that humans have the responsibility to step in and end the suffering. And in a way, he also hints strongly, I don't mean hint, I mean subtly communicates that God is suffering too. And in ending human suffering, we are also, as it were, liberating or helping God. Ariel?
Yeah, Rav Yitz, I mean, that was a masterclass table of contents in Professor Wiesel's approach. Not much to add, but I'll just say that in the classroom, this theme was very, very central, both in Professor Wiesel's choice of course topics and readings within each course. There were courses that he taught called Faith and Destruction, Faith and Heresy, in ancient and modern literature. Faith, the word faith appeared often, and it was always accompanied by doubt. And in that context at Boston University, the students were from a variety of backgrounds, but I remember that the ministry students, particularly the Catholic and Protestant ministry students from different colleges, from BU and other colleges and seminaries in the area, were very moved by the idea that the surprising idea that you can express your faith, as Rav Yitz said, by arguing with God, by challenging God on behalf of humanity, and that there's room for all of the questions within the tradition, that the tradition is flexible enough and credible enough and profound enough to hold all of those questions. And in fact, in Judaism, it's rooted in the biblical tradition itself, where you have Abraham arguing with God on behalf of humanity. And if you read that passage carefully, you notice that God seems to be inviting that argument. God seems to be turning to the camera, as it were, maybe turning to us, the readers of the future, and saying, am I going to hide from Abraham what I'm about to do? No, I'm going to tell Abraham exactly what I'm about to do. I'm about to destroy the wicked city of Sodom and Gomorrah in order that Abraham will argue with me and will challenge me. And we have the same trope repeated in different ways with Moses and, of course, the book of Job, which was perhaps Professor Wiesel's favorite book of the Bible. And the idea that you can challenge not only God, but religious authorities, political authorities, you can engage in protest and rebellion as an expression of your relationship with those people, those institutions, and even with God and even with religious traditions, was very powerful. And this showed up in our conversations in a much more personal way. When I was 18, 19 years old, I was wrestling with a lot of these questions of faith and doubt. I felt that all I had was questions. I didn't have a single foundation for belief that I could really, truly rest on. This is after reading about the Holocaust and other things. And he reassured me, especially in one conversation we had in Jerusalem, in the lobby of the King David Hotel, that faith with doubt is essential, it's good, it's healthy, and that doubt and questions can keep us from fanaticism. And that's really important. It's important to make sure that there's a question mark somewhere within your faith, and that you can approach these difficult conversations and get even closer to God through those questions, and become closer to the tradition through asking those questions, and through shifting from the desire for immediate resolution and the desire for answers, and becoming more comfortable with discomfort, and becoming more comfortable with the idea that we may never have fully formed answers, but we may be able to develop, as Ravi had said, we may be able to develop responses where we take responsibility for the world around us as a result of our questions, where we channel our questions into some sort of positive behavior, positive action. That was very liberating for me as a young person. And I saw many other students, ministry students and others, activated by that, reassured by that, and given a path to walk where they don't have to choose between a world of faith and a world of doubt, a world of the religious and the world of the secular. That bridging, I think, is an essential contribution. And I'll just add that it's not a coincidence that 5 Biblical Portraits the entire book ends with a discussion of questions, and the entire book ends with a question and a question mark. It's not a coincidence that Professor Wiesel chose to end the book that way.
Yeah, that's a really great point. That's something that I think is counterintuitive to a lot of, especially Christian religious folks, this idea that doubting and argumentation, it's not just something that happens, but it's kind of a way or a method of being religious. That's a really great insight. Great. Yitz, one really interesting thing that you discuss in your introduction to 4 Hasidic Masters is Elie Wiesel's refusal to make a career out of Holocaust studies. Instead, he opts to focus on sort of other important aspects of the Jewish tradition and history. And of course, the tradition of Hasidism has a really important place in Elie Wiesel's thought. Could you talk maybe a bit about what this tradition is and how it is significant for Wiesel?
Let me back up and just for a moment explain his comment about not being a professor of Holocaust studies alone. No, because he had, again, it's not one of these very special qualities of Elie. Dealing with the Holocaust, teaching about it, witnessing, it was kind of something that was sacred. I really believe that's the correct word, even though you don't see him in a formal religious structure. And he never wanted it to become either routine. He was very sensitive to what he felt was
oh goodness, I think we're having another awkward moment of tech issues here. Yitz, are you there?
or quota, or in other words, he wanted to remain something that spoke from the deepest personal side, and not as something routinized or homogenized in any way. I think that's so that again remains, and when you think of how often he spoke about it and how widely he was listened to, it also used to amaze me that it was like each time was something new. It wasn't cut and dried, and it wasn't just repeating, a routine that he had mastered. It was each time it was dealing with it with intensity and power and insight. So I mentioned it now. So what if you're not going to be a professor of Holocaust studies, even though you will teach it and witness it and carry it out in the most important aspects, what would you be? And in the end, his conclusion was he wanted to be a teacher. And I think Ariel can tell us a lot more about that aspect of Wiesel, because I think in the end, he saw himself as a teacher. Certainly, if you discuss what profession, he would have said, I'm a teacher, a Jewish teacher. Now, he taught many aspects, as you heard from Ariel before, including humanities and the issues of faith and doubt and suffering and so on. Nevertheless, he put a special emphasis and special amount of writing and work into Hasidism. Well, why? Well, of course, in part the answer is because he grew up. That was his childhood. That was his life. And the truth is, if the Holocaust hadn't come in and shattered that world, he undoubtedly would have been in that world, and I think would have made an outstanding Rebbe or Tzaddik, as they call the really greats. But that's another story. Hasidism, to make it short, is a movement primarily starting 18th, 19th, and 20th century in Eastern Europe, although it came eventually to America and Israel. And the movement itself was a deeply popular one, and you might say it grew out of the lay people, the less educated class, the common people. And what the movement focused in on was, first of all, intimacy with God. I've often thought about a profound aspect of that, the intimacy with God, as the world was turning through the Enlightenment and modernity into a much more secular environment. Hasidism showed us a way of intimacy with God, almost at a level not previously done, certainly not by the average or common folk. Secondly, it had a strong sense of community. They formed communities around particular rabbinic, or I should say Rebbe. They weren't necessarily rabbinic. They weren't necessarily as scholarly educated as the other great message: service of God in the daily life, in the secular life, not just in the formally sacred moments, but in daily activity, finding the ways in which this service is not just service, but is also the divine worship at the same time. And the other very outstanding quality of Hasidut was prayer, song. They used a very, it was a much more emotional religious focus than the more intellectual traditional learning. And prayer and song and mutual help, it all became part of a very strong, powerful attraction of Hasidut. So this is what he wanted to share and communicate. He himself was moved by it, and although he could never go back to being the simple Hasid after what he lived through, and of course, after that experience, after the war exposure to modernity and the West, Hasidut has struggled. Hasidim to this day have struggled with an inability almost to confront or integrate with modernity. Well, of course, in his case, there was no choice about it. So nevertheless, he tried to bring what he thought was its richness and its power of community, its intimacy with God, in a form that would be understandable and usable, integratable into their life by a contemporary person.
Beautiful. Great. So I want to turn now to 5 biblical portraits. So this question is mainly for Ariel. Picking up this book for the first time, readers might wonder about Wiesel's selection of biblical figures to speak about. He talks about Joshua, Elijah, Saul, Jeremiah, and Jonah. I think for many, at first glance, this looks like a sort of eclectic mix of figures. But what is it that makes these specific biblical characters so important to Wiesel?
Well, I'll bridge back to the last question for a moment, just to say that Professor Wiesel used to say that Hasidism teaches us how to build on ruins, because the Hasidic movement grew out of a lot of devastating events in Eastern Europe. And so he saw it as a basis for a post-Holocaust philosophy and approach to life and also to literature and also to reading the Bible. And so one of the things, and your question is a great one, because when I first read 5 Biblical Portraits and when I first reread it, when I was preparing to begin writing the introduction, I had the same question, and I did some research and some correspondence with the folks at Notre Dame Publishing, and we found bits and pieces, but nothing that really explained the connecting tissue across these different biblical figures. And I think one element is, who was he fascinated by that week or that month? And I think that subjective experience and where he found delight was a part of it. But I also think there is an important thread. There is connective tissue that becomes really clear, which is that all of these figures are dealing with major transitional moments in Jewish history, crisis moments in Jewish history, the transition from one era to another, when the systems and structures that supported us, the community, until a certain point, no longer are relevant or effective, what do you do? How did these biblical personalities who are flawed, who are dramatic and sincere and don't always know what to do, are working from certain operating assumptions in earlier biblical history, but are being challenged by new realities? How do they navigate those changes? And how do they protest or challenge old structures and assumptions? How do they build new ones, new structures that could carry the Jewish people and the world forward with a message of ethics and morality and spirituality, a vision of hope? And how do they build on ruins? So in a certain way, each of these figures, some of them are more obvious than others. Joshua is helping the Jewish people, the Israelites, transition from the desert experience and the generation of the desert and the Exodus into the land, where suddenly we're going to have the responsibility of building a political life and structures and economic structures and so on. How do you make that transition from a story of miracles and supernatural living to a story of building a society? That is an obvious transition. Some of the others are less obvious, but a little bit of digging uncovers the major challenges they faced in these moments of crisis and transition. And they were dealing with questions of power and responses to power. So in a certain way, this book is, I think, a very political book, and it bridges Professor Wiesel's deep interest in and knowledge of biblical texts and religious texts and questions of theology and philosophy and metaphysics on the one hand, and his very practical approach to political questions as well in his own time and our time. How was he responding to Yugoslavia, Darfur, Rwanda, and so on? He was looking to these biblical portraits as a central resource for thinking about those current political questions.
Yeah, that's a really, really excellent answer. In fact, I had thought a very similar thing. I don't have a very definitive answer to the question, but the notion that somehow these figures are responding to crisis moments, that's the best I could come up with. Great. Yeah, thank you for that. Yeah, so Yitz, I'd like to
talk about responding to crisis moments. I want to say another way I see Wiesel's greatness, which I think is not fully appreciated. One of the main roles had been not just to teach, but in each period of Jewish history, there were interpreters who communicated the Jewish narrative or the religious faith vision of the world. But in biblical times, you might say it was prophets who in effect interpreted God's will and tried to give direction to society in God's name. The rabbinic tradition grew after destruction, after exile, in which again, the truth is the God of the Bible is not visible anymore. You don't have supernatural miracles and revelations anymore. So again, the rabbis managed to interpret and communicate the meaning, a whole tradition. They didn't leave it behind, but they were able to make it understandable in their time and in different set of circumstances. I always felt that that's what Wiesel did. He wasn't the only one, but a major one. In our time, when you live in a modernized but post-Holocaust world, there's so many of the old assumptions don't carry much credibility. So how do you tell the story? Or since the Jewish religion is about redemption, it's about a final victory for life, it's a final perfection of turning the world into a paradise. How can you talk that way, after the Holocaust, and when you see such a vicious and terrible triumph of evil in the world, even if it was defeated, but before it was defeated, it shattered so many lives and so many worlds of the Jewish people particularly. So again, my answer is that's Wiesel's genius and greatness. I often say one way of looking at night is beyond the memoir, beyond the personal account. It's really a parody, literally, of the Exodus narrative of the Bible. Only it's a narrative not of redemption from slavery, but of being turned into slaves from freedom and from life into destruction and so on. But the parody, not only, the point is, if you try to tell that story straight, it would be it'd be incredible, literally incredible. Wiesel manages to retell the story, not least because he's able to critique it and parody it in a horrifying sort of way, how it reverses. But even in the reversal, he's communicating what is that other narrative, and it's still alive and it's still there. So I think that's another side of him. His readings of the Bible, his readings of rabbinic and Hasidic literature, he also is able to take eternal truths or ancient insights and somehow by rephrasing and by rearticulation, make them speak to us credibly in our time.
Yitz, your response is reminding me of something really interesting you wrote in your introduction. You say something to the effect of, it took 800 years for the rabbinic tradition to sort of take hold. And I'm sort of seeing, from your perspective, you say, I see Elie Wiesel as maybe sort of initiating a sort of new movement inside of the Jewish tradition. Could you maybe speak a little bit to your thoughts?
Well, of course, I wrestle with this all the time, but I do think that I think something new is being born. Just again, it's such a destruction and reconstruction in the rebuilding of life. And of course, in Israel, but not just in Israel, all over the world, the Jewish people responded amazingly to the Holocaust with one of the greatest outbursts of life and creativity of its history. Just as Wiesel, who was a prime example of the victims of the Holocaust, managed to turn into creativity and life and vision. So I think something new is being born, and I do think he will be recognized as one of the pioneers in this particular approach. And of course, so I think that's going to be part of his legacy. And again, one of the other reasons why I think he has a perennial significance is that you can read him at so many levels. I mean, the Hasidic masters, for example, the one that I wrote about, these are stories, and these are grounded in Hasidic traditions and values and lives. These are stories. And yet, and again, you could read them at that level, and they're interesting, they're fascinating, they're surprising, because, again, it turns out, as I say, that the rabbi of great faith and love turns into the Rebbe of doubt and melancholy and who thinks life is hopeless, or the Rebbe who finds at the end he sinks into silence because he can't speak anymore. And finally, when the son begs him on his deathbed to say something, he says, "I'm afraid." In other words, he has fallen into not only depression, but into the silence of death, or living death, so to speak, in anticipation of actual death. So it's a remarkable capacity to do that, to confront the depth of joy and insight, at the same time to confront people who turn out to be very vulnerable, very flawed, very human, and subject to, in these 4 cases, to melancholy and depression and a feeling of what's the use. I would make one more analogy here. And again, I wrote the introduction, and I rethought and reread not only this book, but sort of my feelings about Wiesel. So one of some things I thought I saw for the first time, and again, it's Talmud says that righteous people, some of their greatness you don't see till after they pass away. Anyway, so I saw things in him that I hadn't seen before, and I thought I saw a lot of things in him. Spent many years reading him and thinking about him and listening to him, but this capacity to its recognition, rather, that these 4 great figures, each of them ended up in the end with a certain feeling of failure, frustration, despite, and you think about it, despite this incredible movement, one of the great religious achievements of Jewish history, and maybe of world religious history, yet when they got through, the world was pretty much unchanged. Jews were still vulnerable and persecuted. Much of the status quo and the world itself, still tyrannical and evil, was still dominant. And so you sort of wonder. I remember this again, one of these, I was always nervous about it because it didn't happen all the time, but from time to time, he would sort of stop and say, I've written nothing, I've accomplished nothing. I once said, I haven't written one word about the Holocaust. Now, of course, what did he mean by that? Well, so of course, in part, the answer is, I mentioned that before. He felt no words and no account and no witness could do justice to that word. And there were times he would say, only as somebody was there could understand this. And of course, I would try to tell him, please don't say that. First of all, it's not true because I represent a lot of people who, thanks to you, really do understand a lot of that word. But again, he would say, like these Hasidic rabbis, there were times he would sort of say, I've accomplished nothing. Now, again, he accomplished amazing things, but maybe the gap. I remember in the early years of the museum planning, at one point I really grew anxious we're never going to have a museum because whatever development, whatever model they brought in, he would find it inadequate. And I began to say to myself, and I think I connected to looking back, I feel he chose these four people in part to express his own feeling of loss and of depression and maybe a feeling, what did I accomplish? The great thing about him is that he never let those depressions or those moments of feeling you can't do it stop him from doing amazing and ongoing things. But you had to be aware for it. And again, another thing I learned from Elie, contradictories can be true. And you can understand these things. So that's part of it. But I think it's also a major factor, looking back now, why he chose to write about these four masters.
Great. Well, I'd like to get back to the issue of Elie's interpretive approach, which has come up a couple of times. Ariel, in your introduction to 5 Biblical Portraits, you spend a little bit of time discussing what you call his humanitarian or his ethical approach to interpreting biblical texts. And you give us a really, really interesting quotation of his. I think you mentioned he says this in the classroom at one point. He would say, "One life is worth more than all of the pages that have been written about life." What do you suppose he meant by that?
Well, on the one hand, he sometimes said, I would give all the awards and all the recognition and all the books I've written for a single life to have been saved during the Holocaust. That clarity of values never left him. He never became confused about what's really ultimately important. And in our world, we seem to forget the most basic moral and ethical principles a lot. We get caught up in ideas. We forget that ideas can cause harm, even great ideas about the world, about history, about our place in it. Ideas have been used as foundations for oppression and genocide and war, as we know. The Nazis were intoxicated by an idea of purity. And I remember Professor Wiesel talking about the Khmer Rouge in Cambodia, who wanted to restart history. They were hypnotized by an idea that you can start the world again and with completely new rules even of nature. And religious fanatics want to see the triumph of theocracy. And so ideas can be dangerous, but even good ideas can fail us. I actually, in this regard, I think of something Rav Yitz wrote years ago that's very central in my work, and for a lot of people I know, this is a very central criterion particularly for theological statements, but really for any statement. In Rav Yitz, he wrote something like, any theological statement after the Holocaust, any theological statement that cannot be pronounced in the presence of a burning child is not credible. I'm paraphrasing here. And so any theology that can't be spoken in the face of actual human suffering is not credible. It's not good theology. And the test of any idea and the test of any work of art or any project is, does it humanize us? Does it make us more sensitive? Does it advance the fundamental value of human life? Does it make us more or less likely to ignore suffering? And that's our test. And so one life is worth all that's been written about human life is a reminder of what's really important in a world where we celebrate creativity, and sometimes, as we should, we celebrate great authors, great works of art, but we disconnect those works from the ultimate test and the ultimate criterion of their value, which has to be, in Professor Wiesel's estimation, a human one.
You know, talking about burning children, it's another side of Elie, but I want to really call attention to. You have this combination of a universal human rights, universal responsibility for everybody, not just for Jewish people, universal commitment to end suffering and to make this a better world. But it's distinctive, and it's rooted, in his case, in a very particularist rootedness in Judaism and Jewish people. And of course, the Jewish experience illuminates and guides him as he reaches out to the world. Now, this combination of the particular and the universal, I think it's one of his greatest contributions, that because you get a lot of universal redemptive movements that want to blot out diversity and who want to get rid of all these local particularist loyalties, including the Jewish people, and think of the communists who tried to close Judaism down because they wanted to have universal redemption in Russia. So now I talk about burning children. What I'm thinking is, again, one of his amazing qualities toward the end of his life, let's put it nicely, because he was such an important figure in human rights advocacy, and in the human rights world, and in the left, which was particularly close to him in that world, I would say the Palestinian narrative became more and more influential and accepted, to the detriment of listening to and appreciating Israel and its rights and its narrative. And Wiesel refused to become politically correct or to burnish his credentials in that world by criticizing Israel in ways that were unfair or untrue. And I was thinking of that this week, of course, or 2 weeks ago, when this Hamas outburst atrocity on October 7th, among other things, they burned children, they burned adults and children together. They decapitated babies. And but I was thinking again, that's the point. He was trying to say, he said all along, number one, that evil is not justified and cannot be justified in the name of higher ideals. Again, what we heard before, life is the vital value, not what's written about life or ideologies that claim they want to uplift life but are prepared to wipe out and destroy them. But I think also, again, of his courage and his conviction. He understood Israel's problems and challenges and limits, and he would say them privately, and he would try to help the country do better. But he rejected this attempt to, as it were, counterfeit or falsely distort Israel's true role and its true moral significance. And I saw the pressure, I saw the attempts to push him into saying things that he didn't believe, but he had that inner gyroscope, and he neither intimidated nor would he deviate in order to buy some credential or acceptance in that distorted world. And I was, of course, I miss him all the time, but certainly missed him when I felt he could have said what he could have said at such a moment to remind people again of that evil of burning children or other people, and the evil of, in the name of the ideal world, wiping out and killing and creating atrocities of all sorts. And as I said, the lesson that you can be faithful to and represent your particular community without betraying and without selfishly distorting the human universal rights that you're fighting for as well.
And in fact, the particular is what allows you to have those universal commitments. So he would say that the more rooted in my Jewishness I am, the more I can be effective and committed to universal human rights. That was a very powerful lesson and contradiction to students who had been brought up with the idea that it's a binary. It's a choice. You can be part of a tribe and a tradition, or you can be part of a universal humanity. And that still seems to be a narrative that's very, very common and permeates a lot of halls of the academies and other sources of culture generation in our time. So that message, Rav Yitz, is so critically important right now. We don't have Professor Wiesel's voice, but he left us a lot of not only messages, but tools, I think, to develop our own inner gyroscope and clarity and courage to speak those truths.
Well, you're very much anticipating my last question, Ariel. And in the interest of time, I want to ask just one more question of you folks. You know, practically everybody who's been through the American school system, at least, has read Night, but very few people, I suspect, have engaged really, really deeply with Wiesel's work and his legacy like you two have. What does it mean to make Elie Wiesel's broader legacy, including these sort of lesser known works, available to the next generation?
Well, I expressed my appreciation in the introduction to Notre Dame Press. I think, again, you know, that's one of the dangers. Night is so moving and so powerful, you're tempted to stop reading Wiesel with that one piece. But if he was not only prolific, but he evolving. First of all, particularly the early volumes, you can see coming back from the dead and developing a positive attitude toward life reflected in those various early books. And then he kept going. And again, so my point only is that what I think is very important is to see he's not a one note. And as powerful as that note is, as important as it is, he's not even a one note person when it comes to human rights. He's just a much richer person. And I think if our human rights advocates and our revolutionaries would be influenced not just by Night and by his advocacy, but understand the range, including treasuring a tradition in terms of feeling at home with and embracing a tribe, being rooted in a family. Those are all important contributions. Or as in these two books, how his interpretation of the Jewish tradition makes it available not just to Jews, but to anybody who seeks humanity's values, human values, personal meaning, religious faith. So I feel a real gratitude. I said somewhat jokingly, but I didn't think it was funny at all. My book, particularly the Struggle with Melancholy, you know, there's a kind of a popular kitsch version of Hasidism, and many books put out in those lines that stress, you know, their humor and jokes and singing and all the happy. So I was very grateful to Notre Dame to not be trapped in that superficial model, and they were willing to put out a book that includes much darker, much more conflict-ridden, and much more ambiguous religious lives. But my answer is, don't sample one part of it, try to sample all of it, and you will find a cornucopia of many different insights, many different ideas. Some of them are contradictory, it doesn't matter. The variety and the insight go hand in hand. And I do think that I hope that these new two editions will be part of a much broader issue. I mentioned before the Talmud's comment that the greatness shows even more after death and in their lifetime. So I think that many of his important contributions and insights and the range of them will become more apparent and more studied in the coming years.
Great. Yeah. Ariel.
What's coming to me right now is there was a very powerful Hasidic master named Rabbi Nachman of Breslov who died in 1810. And Professor Wiesel and I spoke about him a lot because I was very drawn to that particular Hasidic master and his teachings and his stories especially. And Professor Wiesel also loved that master and those stories. And Rabbi Nachman once said, as he was about to begin a story, and these stories are like fairy tales, they they defy the usual religious language. So there's a tale that he told that's often considered his most profound tale, called the Tale of the Seven Beggars. And when he was about to begin telling the story, he said, "I will teach you how people drew joy or found joy from within the darkness." And so that combination, that complexity, that arc of facing reality, facing the darkness of the world, and insisting on joy, insisting on hope, creating or generating hope, was something that was, I think, very central to Professor Wiesel's project. And there are two arcs I want to name in his works as a whole, and they both appear. They both came to my attention in the context of a fellowship that we run now based on Professor Wiesel's teachings. In the beginning of the fellowship, we were looking at this is a brilliant insight from our friend and teacher, Dr. Alan Rosen, Dr. Avraham Rosen in Jerusalem, who pointed out that Professor Wiesel's first book is Night, and his last book was called Open Heart. And so if you look at the arc of all of his books, they move somehow from night and the kingdom of night and the ultimate darkness and the encounter with that darkness to, in spite of everything, having an open heart. And so with our fellows, we were looking at the last lines of Night. The very end of the book ends in a very dark place where the newly liberated Eliezer is looking in the mirror and a corpse is looking back. And he writes, "I shall never forget the look on his face as long as I live." That's where Night ends. And so if you only read Night, you have a portrait of devastation, destruction, complexity, the anti-exodus Rabbi Yitz talked about, and it ends with a kind of despair, or certainly a very dark place. And the question of what happens the day after or the page after the end of Night is an important question. And how did he get to open heart? How did he get to joy? How did he get to committing to the future, to human rights activism, to having a family, to teaching, to investing in students? How did he move from that darkness and keep going? And that's a hard question to answer, of course. And he himself said that learning, study, the joy of study, the curiosity of study was a big part of that movement. But that's one arc, from Night to open heart. Because if we can unpack that, then we'll be able to maintain our hope, our joy, without turning away from the world and its suffering, without becoming indifferent, without becoming apathetic, without watching Netflix all the time and just like putting up blinders. We'll be able to face the world, take responsibility for the world, but have the wherewithal to keep going. That's a secret of Professor Wiesel's teachings that I think we really desperately need right now. And the other thing that we look at is there's a really powerful video of Professor Wiesel speaking to a group at Facing History and Ourselves, which is a moral education organization focusing on lessons from the Holocaust, but also civil rights and looking at other dynamics of racism and hatred and responses to those. And this is from the 80s, and Professor Wiesel says, "I wrote Night to build a cage, to let you know, to let the reader know what it's like when everything becomes a cage, when time itself became a cage." And then I had to write all the other books to free the reader and myself from that cage. So in a sense, Night is the encounter with darkness that is necessary to become a real, responsible person, to become morally and ethically responsible and awakened. We have to look at that darkness. But if we stop there, it's all over. And so all the other books, which are celebrations of study, celebrations of storytelling, the portraits of fascinating figures from Jewish history, and the works of fiction looking at moral and ethical questions through the lens of creative fiction, all of those works are helping us to find freedom in spite of the darkness that we're looking at today. So I think that's essential. I think the whole canon of Professor Wiesel's works together offer that kind of, it's not a magic formula. It takes work and time and investigation, but it offers us a pathway for that kind of responsible honesty, together with an insistence on hope and on joy, that I think is the secret to how we're going to get through the moments we're living through today.
Beautiful. That's a wonderful note to end on. Well, unfortunately, we've reached the end of our time here, but I want to thank both of you very earnestly, Yitz Greenberg and Ariel Burger, for participating and being here with us today. Thank both of you for your insights. It was a great pleasure speaking with you. And thanks
Thank
all
you.
for your excellent contributions to each of these two books, For Hasidic Masters and Their Struggle Against Melancholy, and 5 Biblical Portraits. Both of these works are available wherever books are sold. We encourage our viewers to visit and support your local independent bookstore, either in person or online, or you can order the book through the Notre Dame Press website at undpress.nd.edu. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks, Jacob. Thanks, Rabbi Yitz.